Person that we see on the camera has a buffoonish quality. I do not think that individual could have schemed himself out of a paper bag. Supposedly, the Ring camera was operating up until it was destroyed. Do we see the car returning Nancy home? I have proposed the possibility that she was never even brought back. That something happened to her somewhere else, and there's a staging of that home to make it look, which would explain what somebody did in there for 41 minutes, and why the guy at the front door doesn't look nervous, because the deed is already done.
We are now 4 months into the Nancy Guthrie case, and everybody is wondering who committed this crime, who abducted this woman, especially after Savannah Guthrie has come out recently on social media and also on the Today Show expressing her sheer amount of grief since the abduction happened. Today, I am going to be joined by a well-renowned forensic psychologist who is going to walk us through exactly what the perpetrator could be thinking right now. Also proposes a very, very interesting theory as to what actually happened. He's been doing this quite a long time, as he expresses in the video. My name is Jackson Puhai. I am the host of In the Know. Thank you for joining me. Let's get right into it. So today I'm joined by Dr. Gary Briccardo. He is a clinical and forensic psychologist, researcher, and author of the book, The New Evil. Dr. Briccardo, thank you so much for joining me today.
Pleasure to be with you again.
Of course. Now, I gotta ask you, when a kidnapper takes an 84-year-old woman and goes completely silent, is that typically a sign of strategic discipline, panic, or does it suggest that the act of control itself was the primary reward for this criminal?
It would be so nonsensical to abduct somebody and then not seek financial remuneration that it raises the question of whether there even was an abduction, if that's simply a cover story, or if there was an attempted abduction that didn't work out because the captive passed away in the process of being captured or afterward. Usually, any abduction, which is rarely going to involve an elderly person and rarely going to involve a stranger, is going to be a matter that involves ransom being demanded, usually in 24 to 48 hours with a rapid resolution in under a week. The reason being that you don't want the risk of the person being in your hands for very long. Every minute that they're with you is a higher risk of getting captured. And of course, the other problem with this narrative, the abduction narrative, is that an abduction involves a situation where you would treat someone very gingerly. They would not be injured. There wouldn't be, a pacemaker that doesn't work. There wouldn't be, unless an accident happens, because the idea is you want the individual alive and well to return for money.
I'm glad you bring up money because I'm wondering how you differentiate between an offender that's driven by an instrumental motive like money versus an expressive motive like a personal grievance based on their post-offense behavior.
Well, it's an interesting thing because sometimes you can have both. So, in an elimination murder, which is a phenomenon I've defined, a term I've coined, the idea is you wish to remove an individual who is an impediment to something, whether it's money, a romance, freedom, not wanting to take care of somebody anymore. They're a witness to something, that kind of thing. Usually, you know the person too, and so, in an effort to create a narrative in which some outsider comes in and takes the individual or hurts them because you want them out of the way, but have to make it look like someone who doesn't know them, to some degree, could be a passing relationship with them. Um, the issue is that you sometimes accidentally show how much anger you have toward them, so that you can see things like overkill, an extreme number of injuries, things like that. The other thing is that's a clue sometimes that it was a little more personal than instrumental. Is that when something is instrumental, it's planned out. There's a very clear motive. There's a clear thing the person wanted. There was money that now gets collected by somebody, or money missing from the house, or a valuable item missing from the house, or or if this were a sexual crime, there'd clearly be some kind of sexual assault. What we have here is a situation where somebody supposedly comes in to take somebody for nothing. There's no, it's like you want to make it look like somebody, a complete stranger, does this, but then you don't understand that you have to explain why. All I can think of is that the goal was to make it look like an abduction, but it didn't work out.
The perpetrator took specific deliberate actions to cover their tracks in the Catalina foothills from, disabling the camera at 147 before motion was detected again at 212, leaving behind forensic evidence, using the shrubs to cover the camera. Does it suggest someone who was over prepared for the digital hurdles, but less prepared for the real life forensic ones?
Well, I've said from the beginning that I really do not believe that this is the work of a single individual. And so when you're talking about organized versus disorganized and the level of chaos that erupts that you don't anticipate and all of that, things get a lot more complicated if you're dealing with what I've called the chef versus the waiter. And what I think is that there is a person who is some kind of agent or confederate or whatever who was given information to go in and do whatever it is that was supposed to happen. And but whoever is, I think, is ultimately the brains of this operation had a great familiarity with the area and took pains to try to avoid detection, to tell someone what they needed to do to avoid detection. But what I think is something did not go the way it was supposed to go, and somewhere in here there's a kind of arrogant psychology of somebody who somehow, despite feeling intelligent, screwed up. So that, because this is always the classic thing that happens with certain personalities, is that the anticipation that other people are not smart enough to figure out what it is that you do. So I think that probably some of what you're seeing is the result of a couple of different people being involved, different intelligence levels, and not anticipating the realities of what goes on when you're going in to assault or capture somebody of that age in that way. There's a lot that can go not as planned.
Given your extensive work on how overconfidence and fantasy planning causes offenders to linger and leave evidence behind, can you give us some examples of what kinds of evidence a perpetrator like this would leave behind at the scene?
Well, it depends on the kind of fantasy being played out. If somebody's playing out a sexual fantasy, for example, they sometimes something overrides the braking system, and they'll do something on the scene. Like, for example, they want to fully experience the sexual offense, so they'll take their gloves off because they don't want the barrier between them and the victim. So there can be things like that. But when it's a situation like this, I mean, this is not playing out a fantasy in that sense. It just seems to be that there was this sort of pragmatic aim, and you have the problem of needing to remove this woman from the house or eliminate this woman. And the things that go wrong there have more to do with not being able to scheme ahead of how that's really going to go. For example, I thought it was very, very interesting that Savannah spoke about the note that she believes is authentic, where the perpetrator essentially tells her that they're very sorry, but they didn't anticipate that her mother would have a weak heart. This, I believe, if there ever is a arrest in this situation, particularly if there's no body found, is going to become extremely important because the argument will be made it was an accident. We wanted to abduct her, not kill her, that kind of thing. So I can see legally how somebody might, in a scheming way, think, let me write this note. See what I'm saying? Well, at the same time, it's a very odd thing to write to someone when you're somebody who could cruelly take an elderly woman in the middle of the night. I mean, all of a sudden you've got, sympathy that you want to let somebody know that about the heart. So that makes me wonder if the idea is again to paint the picture of an accident. We were trying to take her, but she passed away, that kind of thing. So that could be an example of something that doesn't go the way you anticipate and you think on your feet. Right, or it could be that that's what actually happened. We don't know, but that's very interesting to think about, that particular note.
From a forensic psychology standpoint, what drives someone to target another person with such high notoriety, knowing that it will trigger such a vehement federal and global response?
Well, it's an interesting question. Sometimes it's actually a coincidence. It's that you have, some personal beef with somebody involved who happens to be prominent. For example, you could be somebody who, has encountered someone in the family or worked at the house or something like that. But I have no doubt that the people involved in some way knew this victim, whether, as I said, a passing way or an intimate way. The familiarity is too clear, and with the area, her home, her. And what I think is that if it's on purpose, you have this interesting psychology that goes on where it could simply be you think that person has a lot of money, right? So they're a target because although from a practical perspective, a woman of this age who independently wasn't very rich, and all of that is a sort of an odd choice because she's very fragile, a very strange choice for somebody. If you were a local kidnapper and you were looking at this victim doing surveillance, you would see she has difficulty ambulating and other things, and you would think too high risk. It's too high risk of a victim. We'll simply find somebody else who's wealthy or somebody related to a celebrity, if that was all it was about, right? There are plenty of celebrities, within a couple of 100 miles, I'm sure, of that place, or less. From another perspective, if it is on purpose, it could be that you want to glom on to the notoriety of the individual, right? So, for example, when Andrew Cunanan killed Versace, they became intertwined forever in history. You can't look Versace up without seeing the name of Andrew Cunanan, or vice versa. They're now bound in history. Mark David Chapman, John Lennon, right? John Wilkes Booth, Abraham Lincoln, bound in history. You can see that kind of thing too. And what's interesting about those types of people is they don't tend to care who they kill. For example, Andrew Cunanan was thinking about killing people like Madonna, or eyeballing other celebrities. He just couldn't get to them, so he killed Versace. He simply wanted to kill a famous person. So there is that type of person too. However, when there is stalking of a celebrity with the intention of eliminating them, or the relative of a celebrity, which is even more strange, what you would see is behavior like constantly writing to the family or the person, wanting to assert yourself, appearing outside where it is they're filming or working. Usually law enforcement will find a long trail of contact attempts, crank messages, etc., because there's a kind of obsession with the individual. And we don't see anything like that here. I have to tell you, I think the fact that she is the mother of a prominent person, unless it's financial, doesn't figure in as much as has been postulated by some people.
Are we looking at someone who has a problematic parasocial fixation on the family, or are we looking at someone who was in close proximity to Nancy Guthrie, who identified that she was a vulnerable old woman and decided to jump on the opportunity to abduct her?
I think one of two things is going on here. Either for financial reasons, somebody thought they were going to abduct her, and a family member, perhaps Savannah, because of financial situation, would pay through Bitcoin money, and it would go somewhere that, in theory, would be difficult to trace, and somebody would abscond with the money and enjoy it, and theoretically return her, but she passed away. Second possibility is the entire thing is staged to give the impression of an abduction attempt by a total stranger. And the reality is that there is some person with some connection to her that had a personal grievance and a practical need to get her out of the way. And the whole thing is just one big giant red herring. And but so I think the idea of a parasocial fixation on the family, I don't think so. I think it's more like she posed an obstacle to something, don't know what it is yet, to something for someone who had a connection with her, and it could be as simple as we want your money, but it may be more complicated than that.
If this is somebody like a local worker, they would have to go back to work and pretend that everything's fine and blend in with their community. What kind of psychological traits does somebody need to possess in order to do that convincingly?
Well, the kind of person that would need to convincingly compartmentalize, go back to work, conceal any kind of issue, and not to mention, be hiding evidence. And so the individual would have to be capable of having really very little fear under pressure, like the kind of chameleon like psychopathic or sociopathic figure who would have a history of doing things like that, that would be extremely cool headed about doing that. And I think they would be a lot less amateur hour than we saw on that camera. I find it very hard to believe that the person on that camera, even with that gait that he had, isn't going to be recognized by somebody local, mask and all. It seems a lot more likely that that person would try to abscond, run away, whatever. But the notion of the person being a local person who then blends back into society, I mean, I don't think it would be a local worker who had no prior history of at least petty crime, no history of drug use or petty arguments with people, hot-headedness, things like that, because this is somebody who shows clues of a certain type of personality, and those personalities are not born overnight. There's a reason why whoever went to this waiter picked the waiter, because they thought this waiter would be willing to do this. They didn't go to the Boy Scouts or, the local church to find a candidate. So you find somebody who, is a little errant morally. And so it would have to be somebody that, if there's some local worker, it would have to be a local worker who has a certain type of character. And so and also, what kind of worker? Is the idea that it's a worker that did some work at that house? It's a possibility. All I know is whoever did it has seen that house, has seen this individual, and knew something about her that was a little more than just seeing her on the street.
I spoke to a veteran FBI special agent, Jen Coffin-Daffer, recently. If you've been following her content, she has theorized that the Nancy Guthrie abduction is linked to a trail of wrench attacks, where an anonymous individual on the dark web or Signal will identify a high net worth individual and recruit somebody else to go and conduct the robbery. Now, you seem almost convinced that there are multiple people involved in the abduction and that the person on the Ring doorbell video is not the puppet master, if you will. Do you think that there's a possibility these cases are connected? And I would also ask you, what makes you believe that the person we see is not the puppet master?
First of all, there are only about 72 wrench attacks a year worldwide. Okay. So the probability that there's a wrench attack in Tucson and there's another one not that many miles away elsewhere is extremely improbable in my statistic statistically inclined way of thinking. I don't think so. It's an interesting idea, but I don't think so. And also, the idea is, if you're a person that's trying to commit a wrench attack and it doesn't go the way you plan, you find some other way to get money. You will find some other, because your goal is money. There would be some indication of somebody trying to get money. And what I think is we don't see any clue of that. It looks more like somebody who does it for a different reason and tries to make it look like somebody wanted, to do that. And the other thing is, I think it has to do with the difference in psychologies. I think that the person that we see on the camera has a buffoonish quality, is doing things that is almost like, I was told what to expect when I got here, but nothing went the way that I planned, and he doesn't seem emotionally involved. The person that is on the camera acts like a person just carrying out a gig or a job, and there doesn't seem to be even any anxiety, an appropriate degree of anxiety. I just don't see any indications that there is a personal, anything personal in this for this person. And so, what my sense is a less intelligent person who I do not think that individual could have schemed himself out of a paper bag, no less gotten away with this long and so forth. You have somebody else that gave information to this person and said, here's how the vehicle should go, here's where the cameras are, here's where the, whatever, that's what I picture. And so this far less intelligent goon and this more intelligent person with inside information giving that info to the person is, I think, makes a lot more sense than them being one and the same. I also can't imagine a situation in which you didn't have a person operating a vehicle and helping to remove a person. And I mean, but there are things about this story that are very strange. For example, something that's been bothering me a while about this is supposedly the Ring camera was operating up until it was destroyed by the Ring guy, right? So then, do we see the the car returning Nancy home to the garage pass in front of the house on the Ring camera at the time that she supposedly returned home? Do we see the vehicle pass in front and go to the garage? That's interesting because, you see, it supposedly was running. And so, this has bothered me a lot because, again, I have proposed the possibility that she was never even brought back there, that she never even got back there, that something happened to her somewhere else. And there's a staging of that home to make it look like, which would explain what somebody did in there for 41 minutes, and why the guy at the front door doesn't look nervous because the deed is already done.
How would you explain the blood on the front porch?
Very easy to stage blood, very easy. I'm aware of many. Very easy. You just have to get the blood from her in a different way, but it's very easy to stage blood. And, with a syringe or some other thing to sort of drop it there. Now, I'm not suggesting that happened. Let me be clear. I'm only saying it is a possibility that cannot be taken off the table. And I think it's very important not to give the impression that I think anybody who has been exonerated has anything to do with this. I simply think that someone or some people who have a knowledge of her removed her, eliminated her as an obstacle to some selfish aim and tried to make it look like something else is a possibility I cannot take off the table.
Dr. Mercado, to round this off, is there anything else you think the public should be paying closer attention to as this case develops?
Well, I think one of the things that's been very complicated for me is that the narrative of who Nancy is as a human being and the people around her, all the even little side characters in her life is very unclear. There's been a kind of black box around all of that. And I think that's where you understand the psychology of why somebody would wish to harm someone, other than the simple that it's about money, right? And simple example, it's known that Nancy used to sit out, on the porch or whatever and write in a journal. I'd sure love to see the journal. I'd love to know what her thoughts were in the time up until something happened to her. So I think for me that it's all about trying to figure out the fuller picture of the victimology. Why this woman? Because she makes a very poor kidnapping choice for money.
Dr. Mercado, you've been absolutely amazing. Thanks so much for joining me today.
You're welcome.